The air in the courtroom crackled, not with static, but with held breaths. Every eye was glued to Judge Thompson, his face a mask of sardonic amusement, as he deliberately shuffled through a mountain of documents. The silence was so profound, you could have heard a pin drop, or perhaps the frantic scribbling of dozens of reporters, pens poised like daggers ready to strike. Then, the judge let out a low, scoffing laugh. "Karoline Leavitt," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm, finally looking up at the 27-year-old White House press secretary. Her blonde hair was pulled back neatly, revealing bright, unwavering blue eyes. "You really think you can stand above the law just because Trump has your back, do you?" The prosecutor, a lean, sharp-featured lawyer named Mr. Davies, sporting a perfectly tailored gray suit, flashed a triumphant smile. "Your Honor," he interjected smoothly, "Miss Leavitt, I hope you're prepared. This isn't a press briefing debate. This is a trial." The courtroom was packed. A sea of faces, a mix of reporters, political junkies, and the merely curious, all convinced Leavitt was about to be publicly crucified over her controversial statement on Canada's tax policy. Camera flashes exploded, momentarily blinding, capturing the scene for posterity. The low murmur of the crowd was a palpable wave of anticipation. Judge Thompson banged his gavel, the sharp sound echoing through the room, though the laughter that followed it was almost louder. Davies nodded smugly, certain this would be a swift and humiliating takedown. But Leavitt didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on the judge, an unsettling calm radiating from her. This was no cornered animal. This was a predator waiting for the opportune moment. The judge leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a mocking smile still playing on his lips. His hand tapped lightly on the polished wood of his desk, a nervous tick betraying his anticipation of a good show. Davies, tall and imposing in his glossy gray suit, stepped center stage. His polished black shoes clicked rhythmically on the wooden floor. He adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture of self-assuredness, glanced briefly at Leavitt, then turned to the jury, his voice smooth and brimming with confidence. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pointing directly at Leavitt. "We are here today because this young woman, a press secretary, has brazenly overstepped the bounds of the law, all in a desperate attempt to protect President Trump." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters hunched over their notepads, scribbling furiously, the scratching of their pens a frantic counterpoint to the hushed atmosphere. Davies spun around, his icy blue eyes locking onto Leavitt. "At a White House press briefing," he declared, his voice rising with theatrical flair, the defendant declared, and I quote verbatim, "Canada is on its knees before our tax policy." A statement that is not only demonstrably false, but also a gross violation of the Hatch Act, which forbids officials from using their public position to spread misinformation for political gain. He held up a thick stack of documents, dramatically flipping through a few pages. "The evidence, ladies and gentlemen, is clear. It is undeniable." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed glasses, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Miss Leavitt," he cut in, his tone dripping with condescension, like he was addressing a particularly unruly child. "I hope you realize the Hatch Act isn't something you can simply brush off just because it doesn't suit your style." Chuckles rippled through the gallery. A few Trump supporters in the back frowned, but the majority of the audience seemed firmly on the prosecutor's side, captivated by his performance. Davies seized the moment, his voice ringing out like a well-rehearsed speech. "She didn't just lie," he thundered. "She deliberately twisted the truth to serve the Trump administration's interests." And this isn't the first time Miss Leavitt has crossed the line. We have a litany of similar statements, from Hamas negotiations to Pentagon reform, all demonstrating a clear pattern: abusing White House media power to mislead the public. He paused, turning to the judge, hand on his hip, a picture of righteous indignation. "Your Honor, this is a blatant, egregious disregard for the law." Leavitt sat there, hands clasped loosely on the table, her face an unreadable mask. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge, showing no hint of fear, defiance, or even boredom. She simply listened, as if waiting for a moment that no one else could see. Her blonde hair, neatly secured, framed a face that was more calculating than cornered. Her lips were slightly pursed, not in a pout, but in a way that suggested intense concentration. The judge banged his gavel again, the sharp sound cutting through the rising murmur. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Are you going to remain silent forever? This isn't X where you can simply sit back and wait for a retweet." The laughter erupted again, louder this time, spreading from the gallery to even a few of the jurors, who quickly covered their mouths, trying to regain composure. Davies returned to his seat, a smug grin spreading across his face, smoothing the edge of his suit jacket, as if victory were already his. But Leavitt didn't move. She didn't respond. She didn't frown. She didn't show a single sign of being rattled. Her clear blue eyes swept over the prosecutor, then returned to the judge, radiating a calmness that was almost unnerving. The laughter died down, replaced by a palpable wave of curiosity. What was she waiting for? Why wasn't she reacting? The prosecutor, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, turned back to the jury, his tone growing even more triumphant. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "she has nothing to say. Her silence is her confession." He sat down again, his smug smile still firmly in place, smoothing his suit jacket once more, as if he'd already secured the win. The courtroom hummed with murmurs. The jury leaned in, exchanging glances, a few nodding subtly at the prosecutor's argument. Reporters hunched over their notes, pens flying, flashes popping relentlessly from the gallery, where the crowd seemed poised to watch Karoline Leavitt crumble. But Leavitt remained motionless, hands clasped tightly, her face a study in controlled composure. Those sharp blue eyes remained fixed on the judge, unwavering. The judge banged his gavel again, the sound cutting sharply through the air. He leaned forward, his glasses slipping down his nose, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of mockery and impatience. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice dropping, laced with ridicule, "are you just going to sit there forever? This isn't TikTok, where you can post a few quips and dodge the consequences." Snickers rippled through the gallery again, a few jurors covering their mouths, while the prosecutor crossed his arms, a victorious glint in his eye as he glanced her way. He paused, tapping his fingers on the desk, his tone growing more challenging. "Or do you think you can use some White House press tricks to outsmart us? I suggest you say something before I start wondering if you even belong in this courtroom." The laughter grew louder this time, spreading across the gallery, from neutral onlookers to a few reporters who'd never liked Trump. A man in the corner, wearing a MAGA pin, shook his head in frustration. But the laughter drowned out any dissent. The prosecutor jumped in, standing again, hand on his hip. "Your Honor, maybe she thinks this is just another press briefing, where she can defend Trump with platitudes and walk away. But today, we're dealing with facts, not tweets." He turned to Leavitt, his grin widening. "Do you have anything to say, or should we just carry on without you?" The courtroom fell silent for a moment, every eye on Leavitt. The laughter faded, replaced by a mix of curiosity and anticipation. She still didn't move. But then, for the first time, a faint smile flickered across her lips, not one of fear or defeat, but of someone who knew she held the upper hand. Slowly, deliberately, she stood, smoothing the hem of her navy blazer. Her blonde hair glinted under the harsh courtroom lights. Her hands rested on the table, her gaze locking onto the judge, then sweeping to the prosecutor. "Your Honor," Leavitt began, her voice smooth but sharp, tinged with that signature Gen Z sarcasm. "I'd like to thank the prosecution for this very entertaining performance. They nailed the drama, honestly. I almost clapped. But sadly, they picked the wrong opponent and the wrong script." The courtroom froze. The whispers stopped. Reporters' pens hovered over paper. The judge's smile faded, his eyes narrowing, no longer playful, but now a mixture of surprise and intense curiosity. The prosecutor frowned, gripping the edge of his suit jacket, clearly unprepared for this sudden shift. Leavitt tilted her head slightly, her smile twitching upward. "They say my silence is a confession, but I wasn't quiet out of fear. I was quiet to hear all their so-called evidence before I blow it to pieces." A small "ooh" escaped from the gallery. A few Trump supporters in the back started to grin, sensing a shift in the tide. The judge banged his gavel, but this time, not to mock, but simply to restore order. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone steadier, "if you've got something to say, say it, but I warn you, this isn't a stage for theatrics." Leavitt nodded slightly, her eyes not leaving his. "I'm not performing, Your Honor. I'm about to show you what the law actually says, not what they want you to believe." She stepped forward a pace, clutching her own stack of documents, ready to flip the script. The courtroom went dead silent, every eye glued to Karoline Leavitt. Every eye was glued to Karoline Leavitt as she stepped forward, gripping a thick stack of documents. The faint smile lingered on her lips, but her blue eyes blazed with sharp confidence. The judge straightened up, his glasses slipping down his nose, his hands no longer tapping, clearly drawn into the unfolding drama. The prosecutor, still standing, clutched his suit jacket, his triumphant grin gone, replaced by barely concealed tension. "Your Honor," Leavitt began, her voice smooth but steely, "we keep hearing the prosecution go on and on about the law, the Hatch Act, how I supposedly crossed the line. But there's one tiny problem they forgot to mention, or rather, chose not to." She held up her documents, flipping quickly to a highlighted page, her finger landing on a marked passage. "This law they're using against me, it was written in 1939, before social media, before X, before TikTok, before anything I used to communicate with the public even existed. So, how can it possibly apply to me?" A soft murmur rose from the gallery. A few reporters looked up from their notebooks, pens pausing mid-sentence. The judge squinted, tilting his head as if to object, but Leavitt didn't stop. She stepped to the side, her tone carrying that Gen Z edge of mockery. "They say I violated the Hatch Act with my Canada tax comment. But let's look at what this law actually says. It bans officials from using their public role to influence an election. I said Canada's on its knees in a briefing. That's describing President Trump's policy, not campaigning. So, where's this violation they're talking about?" The prosecutor shot up, his voice rising, almost shouting, "This is a dodge. She's deliberately twisting the truth to shield Trump." Leavitt turned to him, her smile sharpening. "A dodge? No, sir. This is logic you haven't caught up to. Let me break it down, like explaining a meme to someone who doesn't use X." Snickers broke out from one corner of the gallery, where Trump's supporters started nodding in approval. She raised her documents higher, pointing to a line. "Section 5.2 of the Hatch Act. A violation has to be directly tied to an election campaign. My statement was on February 15th, 2025, midway through Trump's term. No election in sight. So what are they charging me with? Telling the truth about policy?" She flipped to another page, her tone growing bolder. "And here's the best part. If I'd said nothing at the briefing, I'd be violating my job as press secretary, delivering official information. So what's my move? Stay quiet and get sued for not working, or speak up and get sued for telling it straight? This law contradicts itself." The judge raised an eyebrow, looking almost persuaded for the first time. He slid his glasses back on, flipping through his own documents, tracing the lines Leavitt had cited. The prosecutor cut in, his voice shaky. "She's bending the law to escape. The Hatch Act clearly applies to all abuse of power." Leavitt spun toward him, her gaze cutting like a knife. "Abuse of power? I'm just doing my job. You're trying to use a typewriter-era law to police the social media age. It's like using horse and buggy rules to find an electric car. Ridiculous." A louder "ooh" rose from the gallery. A few jurors exchanged looks, clearly starting to lean her way. Leavitt set her documents down, crossing her arms, her tone slowing but heavy with weight. The law needs principles, Your Honor. But this law, it's outdated, vague, and worst of all, it doesn't fit the time we're living in. They say I disrespect the law? No. I'm just pointing out the law they're leaning on doesn't mean squat anymore. The judge banged his gavel, but not as forcefully, as if trying to regain control rather than resist. Miss Leavitt, he said, his voice calmer, are you saying this law has no value? Leavitt nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on him. No, Your Honor. I'm saying it doesn't apply to me, and they know it. They just want to use it to shut me up, to shut down Trump's administration. But I'm not here to play guessing games with obsolete rules. The courtroom sank into a tense silence, the air thick, as if the world itself held its breath. Karoline Leavitt stood there, hands resting lightly on her documents, her sharp blue eyes sweeping from the judge to the prosecutor, then settling on the jury. The Gen Z smirk on her lips had faded, replaced by absolute focus. She knew this was the moment to land the knockout blow. The judge, his glasses low on his nose, flipped rapidly through pages, lips pursed, clearly hooked on her argument. The prosecutor sat frozen, rubbing his face, his eyes flickering between panic and fury. Leavitt took a deep breath, her voice ringing out, smooth but powerful. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, lifting her documents. They keep saying I broke the Hatch Act, but let me show you what this law really says, and why it can't touch me. She flipped to a marked page, her finger jabbing at bolded text. Section 12.4, comma, I quote verbatim. No action outside the current scope of regulation can be prosecuted unless new law is enacted. So let's ask, has any new law been written to govern a press secretary's social media statements? Nope. A soft, ooh, sounded from the gallery. A few jurors leaned in, eyes lighting up with curiosity. Leavitt stepped closer to the jury, her tone slowing for emphasis. I said, Canada is on its knees in a briefing. That's describing Trump's tax policy, not an election pitch. But even if they want to call it abuse, their law doesn't apply because it hasn't been updated for our time. They're trying to smash something with a 20th century hammer that doesn't even exist in that law. The prosecutor leapt up, his voice trembling. She's twisting the law. The Hatch Act's purpose is to stop power abuse. She can't dodge it with word games. Leavitt turned, her gaze razor-sharp, a smile twitching. Word games? No, sir. This is the truth you don't want to face. Let me make it clearer. Like explaining Wi-Fi to someone still using a rotary phone. Laughter burst from the Trump supporters' corner, starting to clap. But Leavitt raised a hand for quiet. Not done yet. She flipped to another page, her tone growing fiercer. And here's the knockout. In 2018, Jenkins v. State Department. An official faced similar charges over a Twitter post. The court ruled that if current law doesn't cover new tech, you can't prosecute unless Congress passes something new. That case was decided right here, Your Honor. So what are we doing today? Repeating a loss with precedent. The judge leaned back, tapping the desk lightly, eyes squinting behind his glasses. He flipped through his own papers, hunting the section Leavitt had cited, clearly drawn in. The prosecutor jumped in, his voice shrill, almost desperate. She's distorting precedent. Jenkins was totally different. It was personal Twitter, not an official briefing. Leavitt fired back, no hesitation. Different how, when the law doesn't split personal from official? It just says actions outside scope, and my statements outside the Hatch Act's reach. Did you not read it or just pretend not to? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jurors swapped glances, a few nodding, like they just caught on. Leavitt set her documents down, arms crossed, eyes locked on the judge. They say I disrespect the law. But the law needs logic, Your Honor. If I stay quiet in briefings, I fail the public. If I speak, they sue me with an outdated rule. So what's my play? This law isn't justice. It's a self-contradicting trap they're trying to lock me in. The judge banged his gavel, the sound faint, like he wasn't sure he still held the reins. Miss Leavitt, he said, his voice steady but no longer mocking. Are you saying this law doesn't apply because it's obsolete? Leavitt nodded, stepping closer. Yes, Your Honor. And I've got more proof. In 2023, the Government Ethics Committee proposed updating the Hatch Act for social media. But Congress hasn't passed it. So why am I being sued with an unfinished law? This isn't prosecution. It's political revenge. A small cheer broke from the gallery. Trump's supporters jumping up, clapping loudly. The judge banged his gavel harder, but his eyes stayed on Leavitt, clearly weighing her words. The prosecutor rose again, hands shaking as he pointed at her. She's deflecting. Her statement damaged diplomacy. That's a clear violation. Leavitt turned, voice ice cold. Damaged diplomacy. Canada is still negotiating with us, and Trump's still president. You've got no proof, just empty claims. She paused, facing the jury, her tone slow but weighty. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to break the law. I'm here to defend my right to speak the truth, a right the First Amendment gives me, and you, and this administration. They're not suing me over law. They're suing me because I stand for Trump. But the law isn't a tool to silence anyone. The courtroom fell into a stifling silence, the air heavy, like the calm before a storm. Karoline Leavitt stood there, her sharp blue eyes scanning the jury, then returning to the judge, her hand resting lightly on her documents, like someone who had just thrown the decisive punch. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples, his gaze shifting between the papers and Leavitt, clearly struggling to keep up with her argument. The jury whispered among themselves, a few nodding, eyes bright as if convinced. But the prosecutor, the man in the now wrinkled gray suit, wouldn't go down easily. He sprang up, hands trembling, face flushed with anger and panic. "Your Honor!" he shouted, his voice piercing the air, holding up a fresh stack of documents like a last-ditch weapon. "We have new evidence! Irrefutable proof that Miss Leavitt deliberately broke the law." He strode quickly to the judge's bench, nearly tripping, slamming the papers down in front of him. "This is a recording from the February 15th, 2025 briefing." She didn't just say Canada is on its knees, she added, "They deserve it for standing against America." A diplomatically offensive statement that goes way beyond her press secretary duties. The courtroom exploded in murmurs. Reporters scribbled wildly, flashes popping nonstop. A few Trump supporters in the corner frowned, but most of the audience leaned in, curious for Leavitt's response. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his tone dramatic, like he was staging a play. "Listen to this. This isn't policy description. It's arrogance. Blatant abuse of power. She intentionally harmed international relations to prop up Trump's image. The Hatch Act doesn't need updating to prosecute this. It's clear enough." The judge banged his gavel, but the sound was weak, as if he, too, wanted to hear Leavitt's comeback. He raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but skeptical. "Miss Leavitt, this is a serious allegation. What do you have to say about this recording?" His eyes locked onto her, waiting for a slip, a crack in her confident armor. Leavitt tilted her head, a Gen Z smirk flickering across her lips. She stepped to her table, unhurried, flipping lightly through her documents as if she'd anticipated this move. "Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth but cutting, "I really appreciate the prosecution bringing some last-minute drama. But sadly, this so-called evidence isn't a knockout. It's a hole they've dug for themselves." She held up a sheet, her finger pointing to fine print. "This recording was submitted yesterday, after the case started. If it's so crucial, why wasn't it here from the beginning? Because it's not evidence. It's desperation." A loud ooh erupted from the gallery, Trump supporters clapping wildly, a few jurors stifling giggles. The prosecutor spun around, pointing at Leavitt, his voice shaky. "She's lying! This recording was captured right at the briefing. It proves she crossed the line." Leavitt turned, her gaze icy. "Captured right at the briefing? Then why does it only show up after I've dismantled your every accusation? Let me guess. You needed time to edit it, right?" The courtroom exploded again, cheers from the audience drowning out the judge's gavel. He banged harder, his face flushed. "Order!" he shouted, then turned to the prosecutor. Can you verify this recording's origin? The prosecutor stammered, running a hand through his hair, sweat rolling down his forehead. It's from an official source, Your Honor, but we need time to... Leavitt cut in, her tone sharp as a blade. Time for what? To cook up more evidence? Your Honor, I request this recording be examined. Check the metadata, the edit timestamps, everything. Because I know it's not as clean as they claim. She faced the jury, her voice slowing, heavy with weight. They've got nothing but empty accusations. They say I damaged diplomacy? Canada is still negotiating with us. No proof my words hurt anything. This isn't prosecution, it's political revenge, and they're scrambling to save their sinking ship. The judge flipped through his papers, his eyes darting between Leavitt and the prosecutor. Counselor, he said, his voice lowering, if this recording wasn't submitted initially, I need a clear explanation. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stood there, hands clutching his head, face pale, as if he'd just lost everything. Leavitt crossed her arms, her gaze sweeping the room. Your Honor, they're not suing me over law. They're suing me because I represent Trump. But the law isn't a tool for revenge and desperation. She smirked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Desperation isn't a legal strategy, it's just desperation. The courtroom sank into a stifling silence, the tension so thick you could hear each breath. Karoline Leavitt stood tall, arms crossed, her sharp blue eyes scanning the jury before settling on the judge. The prosecutor slumped in his chair, hands gripping his head, papers scattered mess before him, his face ghost white, like a man stripped of hope. The gallery was dead quiet. Reporters stopped writing, flashes ceased, everyone awaiting the decisive moment. The judge banged his gavel, the sound crisp and final, though his hand trembled slightly, as if he, too, felt the weight of the situation. He removed his glasses, rubbed his temples, his gaze shifting between Leavitt and the papers in front of him. He took a deep breath, his voice dropping, devoid of the earlier mockery. Miss Leavitt, he began, locking eyes with her, I'll admit, I walked into this courtroom thinking you were just a young, inexperienced girl trying to shield President Trump with some clever tricks. A soft murmur rose from the gallery, but he raised a hand for silence, his voice growing clearer. I laughed. I doubted you. But after what I've just heard, after reviewing your arguments and the prosecution's so-called evidence, I can't deny. I was wrong. He paused, flipping quickly through pages, his finger tracing lines Leavitt had cited. You didn't just refute the charges. You exposed a truth. This case was built on shaky, unstable ground. The prosecutor looked up, face contorted, about to object, but the judge banged his gavel, his stern gaze sweeping over him. Don't interrupt, counselor. I'm not done. He turned back to Leavitt, his tone carrying a reluctant respect. You've shown that the Hatch Act, as it stands, doesn't apply to your statements in the social media age. And you're right. Section 12.4 demands new law for actions beyond its current scope, and Congress hasn't done that, the Jenkins v. Fuzz. State Department precedent backs you up. I can't ignore this logic. The courtroom erupted in cheers, Trump supporters leaping up, clapping furiously, some raising phones to live stream. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, face red. Order! Order now! He yelled, but the corner of his mouth twitched, as if he couldn't stop the shift in the air. The prosecutor bowed his head, gripping his chair, no fight left in him. Leavitt stood there, not smiling, not clapping, just a slight nod, her eyes sweeping the jury to ensure they got it. The judge cleared his throat, sitting up straighter, his tone more formal. As for this so-called new evidence, the recording, the prosecution introduced it late, and it lacks clear provenance. I agree with Miss Leavitt. If it mattered, it would have been here from the start. This inconsistency only weakens their case further. He paused, scanning the courtroom, his gaze landing on Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, I don't know where you learned law, from college experience or Trump himself, but you've done what few do in this room, made me rethink everything. I can't find a legal basis to continue this case. Therefore, he banged his gavel one last time, the sound final, like a full stop. The court finds you not liable. Case dismissed. The room exploded. Trump supporters roared, some raising fists, shouting MAGA. Reporters bolted from their seats, shoving toward the door for breaking headlines. The prosecutor buried his face in his hands, papers spilling to the floor. Lifeless, Leavitt stood still, her eyes brightening slightly. Not with arrogance, but pride. She had just defended herself, Trump, and the principles she believed in. The judge stood, his black robe swishing lightly. But before leaving the bench, he turned to Leavitt one last time. "Miss Leavitt," he said, voice quieter, almost just for her. "You're a formidable opponent. I won't forget this day." He nodded slightly, then stepped down, leaving the courtroom in chaos. Leavitt returned to her table, hand resting on her documents, eyes scanning the gallery. She didn't need to say more. Her victory spoke for itself. A supporter shouted from the crowd, "Karoline, you made Trump proud." She gave a faint smile, her first of the trial, then bent to organize her papers, as if it were just another workday. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the echo of the ruling lingered. Karoline Leavitt stood by her table, hand resting lightly on her documents, her blue eyes sweeping the now sparse gallery. The cheers of Trump supporters had faded, replaced by the hurried footsteps of reporters rushing out, phones pressed to ears, voices urgent with newsroom updates. The prosecutor, once smug in his gray suit, quietly gathered his papers, face pale, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. The judge was gone, but his admission, "I was wrong," hung like a final hammer strike, sealing Leavitt's win. She smiled faintly, her first of the trial. Not the Gen Z smirk, but a deep satisfaction. She'd done what no one expected. Beaten a case built to take her and Trump's administration down. But this wasn't just a personal win. It was a statement, a milestone, and she knew it. Leavitt bent down, packing her documents into her briefcase, eyes alight, as if she'd just completed a mission bigger than herself. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed the exit, mics raised, flashes relentless. "Miss Leavitt! Miss Leavitt!" Shouts came from all directions. A young journalist, hair disheveled, pushed forward, voice urgent. "How do you feel winning this case? Any words for the prosecutor?" Leavitt paused, turning, her gaze calm but piercing. She adjusted her navy blazer, then replied, voice steady and weighty. "I feel like logic and truth did their job. The prosecutor, I hope they learned the law isn't a tool for revenge, it's for protection." The crowd hushed for a second, then erupted with new questions. "Do you think this is a win for Trump?" another reporter yelled. Leavitt smiled faintly, eyes glinting. "It's a win for truth. And yes, for President Trump, who taught me never to apologize for speaking it." She turned, walking through the throng, leaving murmurs and stunned looks behind. On social media, the story spread like wildfire. Hashtag Karoline wins shot to X's top trend in under an hour, with tens of thousands of posts, from Trump fans and neutrals alike. One account wrote, "Karoline Leavitt just schooled the legal system. Don't mess with MAGA's Gen Z." Another posted, "She didn't just win. She made outdated law look foolish." Trial footage, live streamed by supporters, hit millions of views, comments flooding. "Judge laughed at the start, shut up by the end. Karoline's unreal." At the White House, word reached President Trump fast. Leavitt sat in her car, phone buzzing with a call from a familiar number. She answered. Trump's voice boomed through, warm and triumphant. "Karoline, you did great. I watched it all. They didn't know what hit him. Best press secretary I've ever had." Leavitt smiled faintly, brushing her hair back. "Thank you, sir. I just did what you taught me. Don't back down. Don't apologize." Trump laughed heartily. "That's right. Now get back here. We've got work to do." As the car rolled through D.C.'s busy streets, Leavitt gazed out the window, eyes distant. She recalled her early days with Trump, from junior press aide to the youngest press secretary ever. She remembered late nights studying law in college, prepping for moments like this, and she thought of the pressures of motherhood, her 8-month-old son waiting at home. But today, she hadn't just fought for herself. She'd fought for a principle, for Trump, and for a young generation often dismissed by an older system. Back home, Leavitt stepped through the door, heels clicking on the hardwood. Her husband, a low-key businessman, rose from the couch, their baby boy in his arms. "I saw it all," he said, eyes shining with pride. "You shut them down." Leavitt smiled, taking her son, kissing his forehead. "Mommy had to, sweetie. So you grow up in a world where truth still matters." She sat, shoulders relaxing, but her eyes still blazed. She knew this wasn't the end. Media dissected the case, from Fox News to CNN. A Fox conservative pundit praised, "Karoline Leavitt didn't just win. She's the new icon of young, smart, fearless conservatives." Meanwhile, a reluctant CNN legal analyst admitted, "She exposed a legal gap. We can't pretend old laws still cut it." Legal experts debated on X. One lawyer wrote, "Leavitt's forcing us to ask, is the law lagging behind the times?" But the bigger impact lay elsewhere. Leavitt's win sent a loud message to Trump's administration. They had a spokesperson not just loyal, but sharp enough to face any challenge. Political rivals grew wary. If a 27-year-old could dismantle a case like this, how strong was Trump's team? An opposition figure whispered in Congress's halls. "She didn't just win. She's making us rewrite our playbook." Leavitt, meanwhile, was back at work the next day. She stood at the White House press podium, eyes confident, as if no trial had happened. A reporter asked, "Do you think the law needs to change after this case?" Leavitt tilted her head, a Gen Z smirk creeping up. "Laws, like tech, if it doesn't update, it gets left behind. I'm not here to break it, but to make it evolve." Her answers spread fast online, sparking a bigger debate. Young TikTokers posted videos dubbing her Gen Z's political queen, while conservative lawmakers floated Hatch Act reforms. But for Leavitt, it was just another day proving youth, logic, and truth could topple even the most outdated systems. Karoline Leavitt's courtroom saga starkly reflects America's polarization and rapid societal shifts, especially in 2025's political landscape, where social media and news shape opinion like never before. Leavitt, a 27-year-old press secretary, faced the Hatch Act, a 1939 law, to defend Trump's Canada tax policy remarks. Her win wasn't just personal. It was a wake-up call for a legal system lagging in the digital age. She argued, old laws can't govern social media, like when she asked, "How do you find an electric car with horse and buggy rules?" mirroring America's reality, where law often trails tech and Gen Z's culture. When the prosecutor threw out a fake recording, it showed the desperation of those clinging to power with tricks, a familiar sight in modern U.S. politics. In a nation prizing free speech like America, you've got to challenge the system when it's out of touch. Learn from Leavitt. Study hard. Like her citing Jenkins v. State Department, stay cool under fire, and hit back with logic. Don't fear old laws or media. Like Leavitt said, law has to evolve for today's Americans, especially the young. It's a call to action. Stand up, know your rights, and force change, because truth doesn't bow to obsolescence. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more in-depth analysis of the intersection of law, politics, and the digital age. Your voice matters, and we want to hear it.